Welcome to Prajim Technologies. I am Venkat. This is part 9 of ASP.NET video series. In this session, we'll learn about what a web server is. Do you really need IIS to develop and test ASP.NET web applications? How to check if IIS is installed on your machine? If it's not installed, how to install that? And finally, we'll look at configuring IIS server to run ASP.NET web applications. So what's a web server? In simple terms, a web server is just a piece of software that can be used to deliver web pages to clients using the hypertext transfer protocol. For example, IIS is a web server that can be used to run ASP.NET web applications. So do you really need IIS to develop and test ASP.NET web applications? No, because Visual Studio ships with a built-in web server. If you want to just build and test web applications on your local machine, you don't really need IIS on your machine. Okay, but then keep in mind the downside of using built-in Visual Studio Development Server is that this server will not be able to serve requests to another computer, meaning if two computers are on a network and you have the web application running on one of the computers using the Visual Studio built-in development server, and if you try to access that web application from the other computer, you will not be able to do that. Why? Because the built-in web server will not be able to serve requests to another computer. It can be only used to build and test web applications on just that computer. Okay, but when you create new ASP.NET web applications using Visual Studio, by default Visual Studio uses the built-in web server. Let's look at that in action. Now we are in Visual Studio where I have this ASP.NET web application project configuring IIS. All I have here is a web form, and if you look at this web form, it doesn't have any code. All it has is an H1 tag showing this message, welcome to ASP.NET training from Prajim Technologies. And if you look at the code behind, there's no code whatsoever. Now to run this application, we can press Ctrl F5, and the moment I do that, look at what's going to happen. The application runs and it renders this page. And then look at the URL here. It says http:// meaning the local computer, and there is a port number 16480. So this is the port number at which the ASP.NET development server is running, the Visual Studio built-in development server is running. And to prove that, if you click in the notifications area on the taskbar, you see this little one, and you see the tooltip ASP.NET Development Server. If you double click that, you should see a window popping up, ASP.NET Development Server, which is used to run ASP.NET applications locally alone. Okay, so that's one way to see the built-in Visual Studio Development Server. Another way is if you actually go to the project properties, right click on that and select properties. You see on the web tab, if you scroll down into the server section, you see a radio button there, use Visual Studio Development Server. That's selected, meaning Visual Studio by default is using the built-in Visual Studio Development Server, and auto assign port is selected, which means Visual Studio will automatically select any available port. But if you want to override that, if you want to provide a port that is available, you can make use of specific port and specify the port number here. Alright, so that's about using the built-in Visual Studio Development Server. So if you want to locally build and test applications, this development server is fine. But if you want to make this application available to other users so they can access it from their own computers, then you will need IIS to be deployed on a web server and then point your IIS to your application. Okay. So how to check if IIS is actually installed on my machine? It's very simple. Click on Start, type Run, press Enter, which will show the Run window. And to get to the Run window, you can simply press the Windows button and R, and then type in inet manager, and click OK. Now after you click OK, if you get an error message, that means IIS is not installed on your machine. On the other hand, if it shows this IIS manager window, then you know that IIS is installed on your machine. Okay, so if IIS is not installed on my machine, how do I install IIS? Again, to install IIS, it's very simple. Click on the Start button and select Control Panel, and within the Control Panel, click on programs. By the way, I have Windows 7 installed on my machine, so if you have any other operating system apart from Windows 7, it might be slightly different. But you can Google, for example, if you have Windows 2000, how to install IIS on Windows 2000. There are loads of articles on the web which will tell you how to do that. So within the programs window, if you click on turn Windows features on or off, then it should show you a pop-up showing all the features, all the Windows features. From this list, select IIS and then the required services within IIS. For example, if you want IIS 6 compatibility mode, you select that. So you basically select IIS and click OK. After a few seconds, IIS should be installed on your machine, and then when you go to run window and type iNet manager, this IIS manager should open up. So let's type iNet manager. So that's how you install IIS. So to configure a virtual directory in IIS to run ASP.NET web applications, how do we do that? By the way, before we configure virtual directory, let's understand what we mean by virtual directory. Actually, let's configure virtual directory and then we'll try and understand what we mean by that virtual directory. Okay, so to configure a virtual directory, go to IIS, and then this is the name of the IIS server. Expand that and you should see something called sites. Expand that and you should see default website. So here you configure a virtual directory, and to do that, right click on the default website and select add application. So once you select add application, it shows this add application dialog box. Here you can give an alias for your virtual directory. So what is virtual directory? Don't worry, we'll be talking about that in just a bit, but let's first create the virtual directory. So let me call this my application. Okay, and physical path meaning the path where you have your web application project. Remember, it's the path for the web application project and not the solution path, because when we created this project, we also got a solution with the same name. So if I right click on the solution and say open folder in Windows Explorer, look at that, it got created in C drive configuring IIS, and then within that I have another folder. So this configuring IIS is the solution folder. Within that solution folder I have this project folder. So this is what you will have to select as the physical path, because this is what contains your web application files. So the physical path for that is C drive configuring IIS, and within that you should see another folder configuring IIS, which is what is your web application project directory. So I select that, I click OK, and look at this virtual directory is created now. Now if you right click on that in IIS, let me expand this. If you right click on that and select switch to content view, this virtual directory, which is pointing to the physical directory where we have our web application project, will show the contents of that physical directory here. And if you want to browse the files within this virtual directory, right click and then select browse, and the moment you do that, look at this, look at the URL now, localhost myapp webform1.aspx. Now previously when I used Visual Studio, look at this, if I come to Visual Studio and press Ctrl F5, look at what's going to happen. Let's get to webform1, let's run that. Look at this, by default if you look at the URL, it's using the built-in Visual Studio development server. But then since I have a virtual directory configured in IIS, I can also use this virtual directory to access my application. Instead of accessing my application like this, what I can actually do, okay, so this one is what is using our IIS virtual directory. My app, if you remember, that's the name of this virtual directory. Okay, now if you remember, if I right click on that and if I go to manage application and advanced settings, you see that the physical path is actually, this is a virtual directory, meaning this directory does not physically exist on my computer. It is pointing to this physical directory. That's why it's called as a virtual directory. And then if somebody in the browser, localhost is my computer, and then within that computer there is a virtual directory called my app. Okay, and we know this IIS knows this virtual directory is actually pointing to this physical directory. Okay, and from that virtual directory I want webform1.aspx. So obviously, since this virtual directory is pointing to that physical directory, in configuring IIS, obviously in that physical directory you have webform1.aspx, which will be served through IIS to the client who has requested that web form. Since this directory does not physically exist on a computer, it's called as virtual directory, and you use that as part of your URL address to actually point to a physical directory, because in URL you don't really give c:\\/ whatever. You give a web address in the URL. So you specify the virtual directory there, which in turn is pointing to a physical directory through IIS. Okay, so we have just seen how to create a virtual directory, through IIS, directly going to IIS, and then you right click on the default website, select add application, and you specify an alias and then a physical path where you actually have your project. Okay, rather than doing that, you can also do that directly from Visual Studio. For example, when I press Ctrl F5, by default it's using the Visual Studio development server. Let's say we don't want that. I want Visual Studio to use the IIS server that I have on my machine, and to do that you can actually select use local IIS web server, and look at this, it will give you a default. This is the name of the virtual directory which is going to be created in the IIS. If you don't want that, you can change it. For example, let's say uh, my web app. So I'm going to call my virtual directory as my web app, and you have a button here, create virtual directory. So the moment you do that, what's going to happen, Visual Studio is going to create a virtual directory on your behalf in the IIS automatically. So the message, the virtual directory was created successfully. Click OK. Now if I go to IIS and then refresh this, I should see my web app created. And obviously, if you right click on that, switch to content view. By the way, these are the features of IIS. If you want to browse the contents of the physical folder to which this virtual directory is pointing, right click on that and select switch to content view, and it should list the same contents. Okay, and if you want to browse that, you can right click and say browse, and look at what's going to happen. It's going to show the same web form, but look at this here. I am referring to this application using my web app, which is nothing but that virtual directory, and previously we are using my web, which technically proves that you can have as many virtual directories as you want, and then point them to the same physical directory, but we don't do that in reality. All right. So basically there are two ways to create a virtual directory. You can either do that directly from IIS, or you can do that from Visual Studio. And to do that, you select, if you want to do that from Visual Studio, you use the configuring IIS project properties vendor. So to recap what we have seen, basically by default Visual Studio uses the built-in web server to run your ASP.NET web applications. It's fine if you want to just build and test your applications, but then if you want to make your application available over a network so that users can access that from another computer, then you need the full-blown version of IIS, and you need to install IIS on your machine. Once IIS is installed, you need to configure IIS, and basically there are two ways to configure that. You can do that directly from the IIS, and to get to IIS you can simply click on Windows Run and type in iNet Manager, and within the IIS which opens up, you can actually create a virtual directory there, or you can do that from Visual Studio, which will create the virtual directory automatically for you. On this slide, you can find resources for ASP.NET C# and SQL Server interview questions. If you want to receive email alerts when new videos are uploaded, please subscribe to my YouTube channel at youtube.com/KUDVenkat, VENKAT. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.